So to start with, I would go to the global scope and just look at how I want that configuring. So I want pretty much everything in recall except my matrix, because that's running my PA. I don't want that to change for any reason. Also worth noting is to turn the MIDI tick box on, because I'm going to MIDI control my external effects. So now I can create a new snapshot, which I'm going to call Start. And within that snapshot, I'm going to go to the recall scope. And I'm going to just think about what I want to scope. So to start with, I actually want the bank to recall. So when I store a snapshot, I want the bank I'm on to recall. And the reason for that is when I go to band 1, I want the band 1 bank to recall, just so I'm not navigating around the desk. It's just a bit of a time saver. Another thing I want to recall is control group members, because the members of the 7 control groups I'm using for mixing the band are going to change band by band, so that needs to recall. So now I just need to think about what I want to save out. So very importantly, that control group running the PA should be saved. So let's do that there. Next thing, I just want to think about any inputs I need to save. Oh, sorry, input channels here. So for example, I've got a timecode channel. I want to save that out. I've got the shout coming into my console. I want that to be safe. I've got voice of God. I've got a laptop. And then I've probably got some groups I want to have a think about saving. So for example, the vocal to fill and vocal to center, I want to save everything on those except the EQ, because I might recall the EQ on a band by band basis depending on if I have any gain before feedback issues. So the EQ might be recalled specific to a band, but I don't want the fader or the mute or anything to recall. I want to just know that anything I do to that is global across the session. And then I also want to save out my shout and also my mixed solo, so nothing changes from snapshot to snapshot. Next thing I'm going to do, now I've built my now I've started building my snapshots, is on here I create a bank which I call line check with 12 mono channels. So I'm going to duplicate this snapshot and I'm going to call this line check 1 through 12. And then on this channel here, number 1, I'm going to go to the first of my band inputs. I'm going to select 12 here. I'm going to patch those first 12 inputs. Then I'm going to select my gain. I'm going to hold down Option All. I'm going to turn that up to 25 dB. So when I'm line checking, I've got plenty of gain on there. When I'm just doing a generic line check, either in the warehouse, in the pre-production period before the show, but it just gives me a really quick way of being able to line check those channels. So I'm going to update selected and I'll fire selected. Now I probably want to do the same for 13 to 24 onwards, so I'll just do one more just to demonstrate to you. So 13 to 24, and we'll go back to that line check bank here and we'll just quickly patch that. So I want 12 inputs patching, I want 13 onwards. I'm going to go gain, optional, 25 dB of gain, go back to my master screen, update selected, fire selected, and if I'll fire the previous. So here you can see 1 through 12 with gain on, now 13 through 24, and I do that for all my inputs, and that just gives me a really quick way now of coming through and line checking through my inputs. So now, having created my line check snapshots, I'm going to create my snapshots for each band. So I'm going to start by duplicating this snapshot, so I'm going to call it band 1, like so. Then I'm going to fire that selected snapshot. I'm going to come to my band bank we created earlier. I could start by labeling it, so I'm not going to label all the channels, but just show you the process. So kick in, kick out, and so on and so forth. I would then do my input routing, so I know these first 2 inputs start on channel 6 for example, and I do my output routing. So for example, I know the kick goes to the kick group, and I'd route all my channels to groups, do all my input patch, and do all my labeling. I would also come here to the control groups, and I would assign my channels to the control groups. So I'd put, for example, my drums onto a drum group, perhaps, and I could label that group. I could call it drums, for example, and then I could update that snapshot. So if I go back to the, if I come back here and go back to the previous snapshot, it pulls up the bank I was on when I stored that snapshot, and when I come here, it calls up the snapshot for band 1 because I'm in snapshot for band 1. And that's kind of how I build my snapshots. That's a very brief overview, but you get the idea. So within the snapshot, it contains all the patching, routing, and all the channel parameters. So after I've built my snapshots, I think about my macros. So let's take a look at that. Now, I'm going to talk you through the macros I have, and then I'll show you setting them up. These aren't all the macros I would usually use, but only having 8 buttons here, I just thought I'd show you a selection of the ways they can be utilised. So, for example, on here, I only have one talk bus. So I want to be able to talk to stage, which would route out an output on stage. So by pressing this button, it turns on the talk, and it also routes this to a socket on a stage rack on the stage, which then is connected to the monitor console. Likewise, if I want to talk to the shout, this one talks the talk, turns the talk on, and routes it to a line output. I could show you how these are created, and this kind of process is the same really for any macro. So create new, I can capture. So first I'd turn the talk on, next I'd come in here and I would route it, so for example to output 1, and that is that macro created. If I come back in here, so you can see the macros created, and I could call this, for example, talk stage. If I insert a comma and I'm on a console where the macro buttons have a display, that would start a new line. So I still use this even if I'm not on those consoles, because if I transfer the file, then my name's already set up. And then to create the talk stage off, I'll just do new, capture, turn this off, unroute this, close, close, turn the capture off, and I could turn this, call this talk stage, like so. And there we have 2 macros. Now, to assign these, I'd decide if I want them as the on or off action, and I'd click the relevant button. So for example, this would be the off action here, and if I come in here, the on action would be this one. So we can see the new macro I just created behaves the same as the old macro. And that process of capturing is the same for any macros you create. So another example of a really helpful macro I have, I mentioned I have a reference system at front of house. Sometimes I want to be able to turn the delay on and off on this. So this macro, you'll see here, turns the delay on and off, but also I've had to put some time on my sub to align it to the left and right reference speakers. So I don't want to turn the delay off, I just want to alter it. So this just adds 120 milliseconds on to this matrices here. Another one is my mix to the solo bus. I want to just be able to mute and unmute it, and you can see here this toggles that. Another thing, I might want to be able to dim my near field, so this macro attenuates these by 12 dB from their current value. So it turns these down 12 and this down by 9, and then undo it, and it puts these back to 0 and this back to +3. Another thing that I think is really important when you're doing these type of shows where you have any inserts is the ability to very quickly be able to bypass them, and perhaps if you're doing off-board compression, being able to switch on onboard compression so there's not a huge change in how the mix behaves. This macro, you'll see, just turns my inserts on and off. I'm not sure if you can see that there, and it also turns the compressor on. Now, another thing I mentioned earlier, I have external effects. Well, if something's going wrong and I can hear I have a problem, but I can't narrow it down to what specific item it is, perhaps it's good to just be able to bypass all my external outboard. So also, this macro here, you'll see, changes the input patch on my 4 external effects between being an AES input from my SD mini rack to being an internal reverb. So you can see I set up 4 internal reverbs to mirror what I'm running externally. And this, as well as turning my inserts off, it changes the patch on here. Then finally, I mentioned earlier about having these vocal to fill and vocal to center groups. Another thing I have, which I'm just going to make this visible for you in the top corner on the editor, is a macro here that when I hit it, you'll see it pulls the fader down by 9 dB. So it's a very quick, I can be mixing the show, I can just reach up here and it attenuates by 9 dB if the artist walks in front of the fill speaker with their microphone. And the same for the center hang. I can just turn it down and turn it back up again. So I don't have to go digging around in layers, it's just on a macro and it's just a quick grab.
Hello Audio World, my name's Scott Maxwell. Going to be going over a festival monitor console setup with this ST9 I have here. Going to start looking at the session layout and then the MISC panel, so your comms in and out, shout buses, shout talks, etc. Within the console. Sort of aimed at the small scale Glastonbury, WOMAD size festivals where 90% of the acts will be using the house console. So I would tend to first, of course, find out what desk is spec'd, make sure that it works for all the artists, if they have spec'd any consoles, if there's any touring engineers coming, etc. Check the firmware of the console, of course. I would then reach out and try and grab some show files if it's that kind of festival. If not, we're going to build our own, of course, the house console. And then from taking that information, I would look into their spec side if there are any files that come back. Obviously checking firmware, and then I'll look at the actual physical patching of their world. So the majority in ears on the first few cards, and the wedges on the second cards. We look at introducing a sort of standard. So if they do turn up with another file on the day, it's going to be a minimal amount of soft patching just to try and work out the genuine consensus of which way that would work. Input wise, of this level show, I would say most of bands would take up inputs 1 to 48. Most, obviously, there's more out there, and we deal with that separately, but the majority would. Now, we can then give those channels to the patch guys, and we stay out of their way. They're very busy, of course. And we would then use the 49 to 56 as miscellaneous inputs, so things like ambience inputs, shouts, talkback, music inputs, etc., compares, all that while there, so it nestles in and it's out of the way of the touring acts. And then with that said, I would then go and start to build my session file, all that information I've gained. If I cross over now to the offline editor, which I've got synced up with this ST9, hopefully this works. Okay, so if I go into here, I can then go into my session structure, which is where, of course, I begin. Now I have given myself 70 channels here, so to begin with. So of course 1 to 48, obviously, and then some extras for some reverbs and miscellaneous inputs that might come up during the build. I've spec myself 12 aux mono sends and 8 stereos. 1 group bus, of course, because we don't need that in our world, really, for this sort of festival lasts. I am running at 96K for better occasion on the in-ears. Now, you might run at 48K if it's being an outdoor broadcast of some variety. We might have a MADI split going directly to broadcast, so you might have to run at 48K, which is fine. Just have to check through your show files, etc. if you've received anything like that. I'm not going to restructure here, but you may restructure if you were creating it. Now, I've already given myself some channel names. So if I just go into my channel list here, go to my inputs, of course, 1 to 48 there, as you see, are free. Coming down further. Now I've got ourselves a patch talkback, stage tech talkback, probably wireless, broadcast talkback, so we've got that involved here. Front of house shout, which is probably a hard wire link to front of house. And then a talk to stage also from front of house on analog. So just in case there's a touring board out front, they can quickly send that to me really speedily, and it's already in the system in Code 4. Now I've got a bit posh. I've got a pink left and right, so 2 mono faders. I just find it really quick If you have the real estate on the board, really quick to flash in ears. If you have to have stereo widgets, so really, really fast, job done. So if we pop down to our aux outputs here, so I've got some wedges in there already and some in ears. So I've got 4 mixes on the front, upstage right, upstage left, float wedges, a separated kit mix. So I've got a kit top and a kit sub. So I generally do that because quite a few engineers these days turn up and they just brought like a sub because the drummer's on in ears. Really fast way of doing it, and you've got less spill coming off the stage from another box that's not being used from the top, so you can mute that quite sufficiently and quickly. Stereo side fill. So we've got 5 stereo in-ear mixes, a tech mix, which we'll go over. Now that tech mix, if it's a house board, this will normally reflect to our guys on the audio team, so patch engineers, etc. But also I've had a few where they've required a tech mix, backline people. That's just a quick one to throw out. And then we've got a shout mix and a shout duck. Now we'll go over that shout duck later, but shout mix is basically for my in-ear communication stuff. So then we've got a shout mix and a shout duck. The shout mix, I'll show you that shortly, basically routes to my in-ears constantly, so here communications. A shout duck, we'll also go that soon as well. It's slightly related to that tech mix, what we'll go over shortly. The only thing we haven't done yet is just checking here is the solo input. So I've also labelled my I have a stereo IEM solo, which is solo 1 I've renamed, a solo 2, which is my wedge solo, a floor wedge, as you'll see the purposes for that later on. I do use my talk input as my dedicated shout input because it's just so easy to route it anywhere, really, really fast. You can have it on macro keys, etc. We'll go over later on. It's just much more flexible. So go from there, I'm going to pull that out now. So if I go to my right-hand side of my console, so I've already put these on the layers. Have you seen in other videos how to do that already? So I have my mixes here to the wedges and my dual solos. I try to stick them on every level. So as I go through each layer, they always appear in the same place. It's just quite useful that way. If you need to grab something, you can hear it